After 50 years of marriage, my husband looked me straight in the eye and called me useless. Those words shattered something inside me that I didn't even know could break. But what he didn't expect was that this useless woman would rewrite her entire will, liquidate everything, and disappear to Switzerland, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own cruelty. By the time he realized what he'd lost, I was already sipping wine in the Swiss Alps, watching my new life unfold while his world crumbled back home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Cambridge, and at 72 years old, I never imagined I'd be starting over in a foreign country. But sometimes life forces your hand in ways you never saw coming. For 5 decades, I had been Mrs. Richard Cambridge, the dutiful wife who managed the household, raised 3 children, and built what I thought was a partnership that would last until death do us part. Our story began in 1973 when I was 22 and Richard was 25. He was a junior accountant at a small firm in Portland, Oregon, and I was a secretary at the same company. He was charming, ambitious, and promised me a life filled with adventure and security. What I got instead was 50 years of slowly disappearing into the background of my own existence. The early years weren't terrible. We bought our first house in the suburbs, a modest 3-bedroom ranch that we filled with dreams and eventually children. Sarah came first in 1975, then Michael in 1977, and finally Jennifer in 1980. I quit my job to raise them, something Richard insisted would be temporary. Just until they're in school, he said. Then it became just until they're older, and eventually, it became permanent. Richard's career flourished while mine became a distant memory. He climbed from junior accountant to senior partner at Brennan Associates, eventually buying out the firm entirely in 1995. Cambridge Financial became one of the most successful accounting firms in the Pacific Northwest, handling major corporate clients and wealthy individuals. I watched from the sidelines as my husband transformed from the awkward young man I'd married into a confident, successful businessman. What I didn't realize until much later was that somewhere in that transformation, Richard had also developed a fundamental belief that his success was entirely his own doing. In his mind, my contributions to our life together, raising his children, managing his household, entertaining his clients, supporting his career moves, had become invisible, worthless, unimportant. The children grew up and moved away. Sarah became a doctor in Seattle, Michael took a job with a tech company in San Francisco, and Jennifer married young and settled in Denver with her husband and 2 children. Our big house grew quiet, and I found myself wondering what my purpose was supposed to be now that the active parenting phase was over. I tried to reconnect with Richard, suggesting we travel or take up hobbies together. But he was always too busy, always had another client meeting or business trip. When I mentioned maybe getting a part-time job or doing volunteer work, he dismissed the idea entirely. "What would people think if my wife had to work?" he'd say. "Besides, you've been out of the workforce too long. What skills do you even have anymore?" Those casual put-downs became more frequent as the years passed. Richard had surrounded himself with successful people, clients, business partners, golf buddies, and somewhere along the way, he started seeing me as an embarrassment, a relic from his less successful past that he couldn't quite figure out how to upgrade. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I remember the date exactly because it was our 50th wedding anniversary, though Richard had apparently forgotten. I had spent weeks planning a quiet celebration, nothing elaborate, just dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. I'd made reservations, bought a new dress, even had our wedding photo restored and framed as a surprise. Richard came home late from the office, as usual, and found me waiting in the living room, wearing my new dress. "What's the occasion?" he asked, barely glancing at me as he loosened his tie. "It's our anniversary, Richard. 50 years today." He stopped mid-motion, his face showing a flicker of something that might have been guilt before hardening into irritation. "Oh, right. Look, Victoria, I'm exhausted. Can we do this another time? I made reservations at Romano's, the place where—" "I know where it is," he snapped, and I said I'm tired. "Cancel the reservation." I felt something crack inside my chest, but I tried once more. "Richard, it's our 50th anniversary. This is important." That's when he turned to look at me, really look at me, and what I saw in his eyes was something I'd never seen before. Pure contempt. "Important to who, Victoria? What exactly have you contributed to this marriage that makes you think you get to make demands on my time?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "I raised your children. I maintained your home. I supported your career for 50 years. Richard laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Supported my career? By doing what? Sitting around the house all day? Anyone can raise children and keep house, Victoria. Those aren't skills. Those aren't contributions. Those are just basic expectations. Richard, please. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me when my colleagues ask what my wife does and I have to say, nothing? When they talk about their wives, careers, their accomplishments, their contributions to society, and I have to stand there with nothing to say about you? Each word felt like a knife. I gave up my career to support yours. That was our agreement. What career? He was warming up now, 50 years of apparently suppressed resentment pouring out. You were a secretary, Victoria. Not exactly a corner office trajectory. You gave up answering phones and filing papers. Don't pretend that was some great sacrifice. I stood there in my anniversary dress, feeling smaller with each word. But Richard wasn't finished. The truth is, you're useless. You've been useless for years. You have no skills, no interests, no purpose beyond being a drain on my resources. At least when the kids were young, you had something to do. Now? You're just here, taking up space, spending my money, and expecting me to pretend that maintaining a household is some kind of meaningful work. The word useless hung in the air between us like poison. 50 years of marriage, and my husband had just reduced my entire existence to that single devastating word. You don't mean that, I whispered. I absolutely mean it. Look at yourself, Victoria. You're 72 years old with nothing to show for your life except 3 children who barely call and a house you didn't pay for. You have no friends because you never developed any interests. You have no hobbies because you never tried anything challenging. You have no career because you took the easy path of depending on me for everything. I felt tears starting, but Richard wasn't done dismantling me. Do you know what the worst part is? I could replace everything you do with a housekeeper who'd be more efficient and less expensive. At least she'd understand that she was providing a service instead of acting like she deserves gratitude for basic household maintenance. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there in my carefully chosen anniversary dress, looking at the man I'd spent 50 years loving, supporting, and believing in, and realized that somewhere along the way he'd stopped seeing me as a person altogether. I'm going upstairs, I said quietly. Cancel the reservation. Richard called after me, already reaching for his laptop. And next time, check with me before making plans. My time is valuable, even if yours isn't. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom on shaking legs, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed I'd shared with him for half a century. The restored wedding photo was still in its gift bag, our young faces smiling.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Back at me from 49 years ago, those people looked so hopeful, so sure they were building something beautiful together. I looked at myself in the dresser mirror and tried to see what Richard saw, an old woman with gray hair and wrinkles, wearing a dress that suddenly felt foolish. A woman who had no career, no independent income, no life outside the one Richard had allowed me to have. But as I sat there, something began to shift inside me. Yes, I was 72. Yes, I had spent 50 years focusing on family instead of career. But useless? Useless implied that I had no value, no worth, no capability. Richard was wrong about that. Over the next several days, I moved through our house like a ghost. Richard acted as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed 50 years of marriage with a single word. He went to work, came home, ate the dinners I prepared, and watched television, as if his wife hadn't just been shattered into pieces in their living room. But I was far from shattered, I was thinking. On Friday morning, after Richard left for the office, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the public library and spent 6 hours researching things I'd never thought to research before. Property laws in Oregon. Divorce settlements for long-term marriages. Asset division. Retirement account distributions. International banking. Residency requirements for various countries. What I learned was fascinating. After 50 years of marriage, I was entitled to half of everything Richard considered his. The house we'd lived in for 30 years, purchased with money he'd earned while I maintained his household and raised his children, was half mine. The business he'd built while I handled every aspect of his personal life so he could focus on work was half mine. The retirement accounts, the investment portfolios, the savings accounts, all of it accumulated during our marriage, all of it legally half mine. Richard seemed to have forgotten this fundamental fact about community property laws. I spent the following week making quiet appointments. A lawyer who specialized in divorce law. A financial advisor who worked with newly single women. A real estate agent who could give me an estimate on our home's value. Each conversation revealed more clearly just how much useless Victoria was actually worth. The numbers were staggering. Richard's business alone was valued at over $4 million. Our house was worth $800,000. The investment accounts totaled another $2 million. Retirement funds added another $1.5 million. In total, my half of our marital assets came to approximately $4 million. $4 million accumulated by a, quote, woman who had contributed nothing to the marriage. But divorce, I realized, would give Richard exactly what he seemed to want: freedom from his burdensome wife, and the ability to start over with someone he found more worthy of his time and attention. It would also keep me tied to him through legal proceedings, asset division arguments, and ongoing conflict. I wanted something cleaner, something more final, something that would leave Richard with exactly what he'd told me I deserved: nothing. That's when I started researching international relocation. Switzerland had always fascinated me, though I'd never mentioned it to Richard since he dismissed my interests as unimportant. The country offered excellent health care, stunning natural beauty, and most importantly for my purposes, residency opportunities for people with sufficient financial resources. I spent hours reading about Swiss immigration policies, banking systems, and the process for establishing residency. What I learned was that with enough money and the right legal assistance, a person could relocate to Switzerland and establish a new life with relative ease. The plan began to form slowly, like a photograph developing in solution. Richard had always handled our finances, insisting that I didn't need to worry about complicated things like investments and accounts. What he didn't know was that as his wife of 50 years, I had legal access to everything. Every account, every investment, every asset accumulated during our marriage was legally mine to access. I started small. A few $1,000s moved from our joint savings to a new individual account I opened at a different bank. Then slightly larger amounts, always careful to stay below the reporting thresholds that might trigger automatic notifications. Over the course of 6 weeks, I quietly moved nearly $2 million into accounts that Richard didn't know existed. The beautiful thing about being married to a successful financial professional was that our accounts contained far more money than Richard actively monitored. As long as his business account maintained its balance, and the household bills were paid from our joint checking, he never looked closely at the investment and savings accounts. Why would he? They were always there, always growing, and always under his control. Except, now they weren't. While I was liquidating our assets, I was also making other preparations. I applied for a Swiss residency visa, using my newly substantial bank accounts as proof of financial independence. I researched neighborhoods in Geneva, Zurich, and smaller towns in the Swiss Alps. I even took online German lessons, though many Swiss spoke excellent English. Most importantly, I made an appointment with a different lawyer to discuss updating my will. Richard and I had standard wills that left everything to each other, then to our children, but circumstances had changed. If Richard found me so useless, so burdensome, so worthless, then perhaps he wouldn't miss me if I were gone. And perhaps he wouldn't deserve to inherit anything from someone he considered a drain on his resources. My new will was a work of art. It left Richard exactly $1, with a note explaining that this represented his fair share of the assets accumulated by a useless woman. Everything else, my half of our marital assets, which I was now in the process of claiming, went to our children, with specific instructions that Richard was to have no access to or control over any of it. But there was more. I also included provisions for several charities that supported women starting over later in life, organizations that helped older women develop new skills and find purpose after decades of traditional homemaking. If Richard thought household management wasn't a real skill, he'd be interested to learn that these organizations disagreed. The final touch was a personal letter to Richard, to be delivered along with the will after my departure. In it, I thanked him for finally showing me his true feelings after 50 years of pretending to value our partnership. I explained that since he found me so useless, I was removing the burden of my presence from his life. And I informed him that someone who contributed nothing to a marriage certainly shouldn't be expected to leave anything behind for the partner who provided everything. By mid-May, everything was in place. My Swiss residency application had been approved. I'd found a beautiful apartment in a small town called Montreux, overlooking Lake Geneva. The lease was signed, the utilities were connected, and my new Swiss bank account was ready to receive the final transfers from my Oregon accounts. I'd purchased a one-way ticket to Geneva, scheduled for departure on a Tuesday morning when Richard would be in his office, completely unaware that his useless wife was about to disappear from his life forever. The night before my departure, I cooked Richard's favorite meal, prime rib with roasted vegetables, and his mother's recipe for dinner rolls. He came home from work in a good mood, having closed a major client deal that day. "It smells good in here," he said, actually smiling at me for the first time in months. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," I replied, setting his plate in front of him. "Just thought you deserved a nice meal." He chatted about his day while he ate, telling me about the new client and the substantial fees they'd be paying. He was animated, enthusiastic, more engaged with me than he'd been in years. It occurred to me that Richard was happy when he felt successful and important, and that my presence only bothered him when he was forced to actually consider my role in his life. After dinner, he settled into his recliner with a glass of wine and his laptop, working on business while I cleaned the kitchen. This had been our routine for decades, him pursuing his important work while I handled the domestic responsibilities that kept his life running smoothly. "Victoria," he called from the living room, "have you seen the statements for the Merrill Lynch account?" I wanted to check something. My heart skipped, but I kept my voice steady. "They're in your desk drawer, where they always are." "Right." "Thanks." I listened to him shuffling through papers, waiting for the moment he might notice something amiss. But Richard trusted his systems implicitly. If money was supposed to be in an account, he assumed it was there unless he had reason to think otherwise. "Everything look right?" I asked casually. "Yeah, fine. Just wanted to verify a transfer went through." I finished the dishes and went upstairs, leaving Richard to his evening routine. In our bedroom, I took one last look around the space we'd shared for 30 years. The king-size bed, where we'd slept side by side for decades. The dresser that held both our clothes. The photographs of our children and grandchildren scattered across every surface. Tomorrow, Richard would come home to an empty house and a note explaining that his useless wife had finally done something useful. She'd removed herself from his life completely. I set my alarm for 5 a.m., 3 hours before Richard typically woke up. My suitcase was already packed and hidden in the guest room closet. My passport, tickets, and new Swiss bank cards were in my purse. Everything else I was leaving behind, the clothes, the jewelry, the accumulated possessions of 50 years, were part of a life that no longer belonged to me. As I lay in bed listening to Richard's familiar breathing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement. For the first time in decades, I was about to do something entirely for myself, entirely on my own terms. Something that had nothing to do with supporting someone else's dreams or maintaining someone else's comfort. I was about to discover what Victoria Cambridge was capable of when she stopped being Richard's useless wife and started being her own person. The alarm buzzed softly at 5 a.m., and I slipped out of bed without waking Richard. I dressed quickly in traveling clothes, grabbed my hidden suitcase, and crept downstairs to the kitchen where I left 2 envelopes on the counter. One contained my updated will, to be given to our family lawyer. The other was my letter to Richard, explaining exactly what his useless wife had accomplished while he wasn't paying attention. I called a taxi from my cell phone and waited by the front door, watching the sunrise through the windows of the house I'd called home for 30 years. When the cab arrived, I took one last look around, grabbed my purse and suitcase, and walked out the door of my old life forever. At the airport, as I waited for my flight to board, I thought about Richard waking up to find me gone. He'd probably assume I'd gone grocery shopping or to run errands. It might be hours before he found the letters, days before he realized I wasn't coming back. By then, I'd be sipping coffee in Switzerland, looking out at the Alps and planning the next chapter of my life. A life where my worth wasn't determined by someone else's opinion, where my contributions mattered, and where being 72 meant I had wisdom and experience rather than just wrinkles and outdated skills. Richard had called me useless, and in a way, he'd given me the greatest gift possible. He'd forced me to prove him wrong. The flight to Geneva was the longest 8 hours of my life, but not because of discomfort or anxiety. For the first time in 50 years, I was completely alone with my thoughts, no one expecting me to prepare meals, answer questions, or manage someone else's schedule. I stared out the airplane window, watching the Atlantic Ocean pass beneath us, and felt something I hadn't experienced since I was 22 years old: complete freedom. When the plane touched down at Geneva Airport, I gathered my single suitcase and walked through customs with my Swiss residency documents. The immigration officer, a pleasant woman about my daughter Sarah's age, stamped my passport and welcomed me to Switzerland in perfect English. "Visiting family?" she asked politely. "Starting over," I replied, and her smile widened with what looked like approval. The train from the airport to Montreux took less than an hour, winding through countryside so beautiful, it looked like a postcard. Rolling green hills dotted with chalets, pristine lakes reflecting snow-capped mountains, small villages that seemed untouched by time. As the train pulled into Montreux station, I caught my first glimpse of Lake Geneva stretching endlessly toward the French Alps, and I understood why people called this place paradise. My new apartment was a 10-minute walk from the station, located in a converted 19th-century villa that had been divided into 6 modern units. Mine was on the 2nd floor with a balcony overlooking the lake. The previous tenant had left it furnished with simple, elegant pieces: a sofa and chairs in cream-colored linen, a dining table for 4, a bedroom with a view of the mountains. Everything was clean, comfortable, and utterly peaceful. I set my suitcase down in the middle of the living room and walked out onto the balcony. The late afternoon sun was casting golden light across the water, and I could hear church bells ringing somewhere in the distance. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax completely. My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped. But it wasn't Richard. It was Sarah, my eldest daughter, texting from Seattle. "Mom, Dad called me looking for you. He says you left him a note and went somewhere, but he couldn't understand it. Are you okay? Please call me." I stared at the message for a long moment. So Richard had found my letter. I wondered if he'd read it carefully or just skimmed it, looking for information about where I'd gone. I wondered if he'd checked our bank accounts yet. I typed back, "I'm fine, honey. I'm starting a new chapter. I'll call you soon and explain everything." Sarah responded immediately, "Mom, you're scaring me. Dad says you cleaned out your bank accounts and left town. What's going on?" So he had checked the accounts. Faster than I'd expected, but not surprising. Richard was thorough about money. Even when it came to money he'd assumed would always be there. I turned off my phone without responding. Sarah deserved an explanation, but not yet. Not until I'd had time to settle in and figure out exactly how I wanted to handle the communications with my children. They loved their father, and they loved me, and what I'd done was going to force them to see their parents' marriage in a completely different light. The next morning, I woke up naturally at sunrise. No alarm clock, no schedule to maintain, no one else's routine to accommodate. I made coffee in my new kitchen and took it out to the balcony to watch the lake wake up. Fishermen in small boats were already casting their lines, and early commuters were boarding the ferry that would take them to offices in Geneva or Lausanne. I spent my first week in Switzerland doing simple, practical things that felt revolutionary after 50 years of managing someone else's life. I opened a local bank account and transferred funds from my Geneva account. I registered with the local municipality, getting my temporary residence permit updated with my new address. I found a grocery store, a pharmacy, and a doctor who spoke English. Every task I completed felt like a small victory. When I successfully navigated the Swiss banking system, I thought about Richard saying I had no skills. When I managed to communicate with the municipal clerk in a combination of English and my rudimentary German, I thought about his assertion that I'd never tried anything challenging. Most importantly, I started learning about my new home. Montreux was famous for its annual jazz festival, its mild climate, and its history as a haven for artists and writers. Charlie Chaplin had lived here. Freddie Mercury had recorded albums here. It was a place where creative people came to find inspiration and peace. I enrolled in German language classes at the local community center, something I'd wanted to do for years but had never pursued because Richard considered my interests frivolous. My classmates were an international mix: young professionals from multinational companies, retirees from various countries, and other women like me who were starting new lives in Switzerland for reasons they didn't always share. During my second week, I finally turned my phone back on and found 47 missed calls and 32 text messages. Most were from Richard, but several were from our children. The progression of Richard's messages told a story that made me smile despite myself. The first few were confused and slightly annoyed. "Victoria, where did you go? Come home immediately. We need to discuss this." Then they became more urgent. "Victoria, this isn't funny. I've called the police and filed a missing person report. Come home now, or I'm hiring a private investigator." By day 3, they'd turned angry. "You can't just disappear and steal our money. I'm freezing all the accounts and calling my lawyer. This is theft." By day 5, the tone had shifted to something approaching panic. "Victoria, please call me. I don't understand what's happening. The bank says you legally withdrew the money, but this is our life savings, our retirement. How could you do this to me?" The most recent message, sent just that morning, was different. "I read your letter again. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Please come home so we can talk about this. I miss you." The children's messages were concerned but less frantic. They knew me well enough to understand that I wouldn't have left without good reasons, even if they didn't understand what those reasons were. Sarah had called twice. Michael had sent several thoughtful texts asking if I was safe and whether I needed anything. And Jennifer had left a voicemail saying she supported whatever decision I'd made and would be there for me when I was ready to talk. I decided to call Sarah first. She answered on the first ring. "Mom, thank God, where are you? Dad is going crazy. He says you took all the money and disappeared." "I'm safe, honey. I'm in a beautiful place starting a new life." "But why? What happened?" "Dad says you two had an argument, but he doesn't understand why you'd leave." I took a deep breath. "Sarah, your father told me on our 50th wedding anniversary that I was useless, that I'd contributed nothing to our marriage or family, that I was an embarrassment and a burden." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. "He said what?" "He said I was useless, that anyone could do what I'd done for 50 years, that I had no skills, no value, no purpose except spending his money." "Mom, that's—" Sarah's voice trailed off. "That's horrible. But surely he didn't mean it. Dad says things when he's stressed." "He meant every word, sweetheart. And you know what? He was right about one thing. I did spend 50 years depending on him financially, so I decided to fix that problem. By taking the money and running away? By taking my half of our marital assets and using them to build an independent life. Your father seems to have forgotten that everything he considers his was actually accumulated during our marriage, which makes half of it legally mine." Sarah was quiet again. "How much money are we talking about, Mom?" "About $4 million. My share of what we built together over 50 years. $4 million. Sarah's voice was faint. Mom, Dad is telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown, that you're not thinking clearly. I've never thought more clearly in my life. Sarah, I want you to think about something. In all the years you've known me, have I ever made an impulsive decision? Have I ever acted irrationally, or without considering the consequences? No, never. You're the most careful, thoughtful person I know. Then trust me when I tell you that this decision was not impulsive. I spent weeks planning it. I researched everything carefully. I made sure I was legally entitled to the money I took. And I left your father with exactly what he told me I deserved. Nothing. But where are you? Are you coming back? I looked out at Lake Geneva, watching the afternoon light dance on the water. I'm in Switzerland, honey. And no, I'm not coming back. This is my home now. Switzerland? Mom, you don't speak German. You don't know anyone there. How are you going to live? I'm learning German. I'm meeting people. And I'm living quite well, thank you. It turns out that $4 million provides a very comfortable lifestyle, especially when you're not supporting someone who thinks you're worthless. Mom, I don't know what to say. This is so unlike you. No, Sarah, this is exactly like me. This is who I was before I became your father's wife and your mother. This is who I could have been if I'd ever been allowed to find out. After I hung up with Sarah, I called Michael and Jennifer with similar conversations. Michael was shocked but ultimately supportive, saying he'd always thought his father took me for granted. Jennifer cried when I told her what Richard had said, then got angry on my behalf, asking why I'd stayed as long as I did. None of them had known how their father really felt about me. To them, we'd seemed like a stable, traditional couple who'd built a successful life together. They'd never seen the gradual erosion of respect, the casual dismissals, the way Richard had slowly stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as household staff. But they were adults with their own lives, and they adapted to the new reality faster than I'd expected. Sarah promised to stay in touch and asked if she could visit sometime. Michael offered to help me with any legal issues that might arise. Jennifer asked if I needed money, laughing when I explained that I was now significantly wealthier than any of them. The call I didn't make was to Richard. Let him wonder. Let him panic. Let him try to figure out how his useless wife had managed to outmaneuver him so completely. Meanwhile, I was discovering what retirement looked like when it was actually about living rather than just existing. I joined a hiking group that explored the Swiss Alps every weekend. I enrolled in a painting class, something I'd always wanted to try but had never had time for. I volunteered at a local charity that helped refugees learn English, discovering that my decades of managing household logistics translated perfectly to helping coordinate services for displaced families. Most surprisingly, I joined a book club that met at the local library. The other members were mostly Swiss women my age, and their stories fascinated me. Several were widows who'd moved to Montreux after their husbands died, choosing to spend their remaining years in a place that brought them joy. Others were divorced women who'd started over in their 60s and 70s, creating new identities after decades of being defined by their relationships. One woman, Marguerite, had left her husband after 40 years when she discovered he was having an affair. She'd taken her half of their assets and opened a small gallery in town, showcasing local artists. Another, Elena, had been a housewife in Germany until her children were grown, then moved to Switzerland and became a tour guide, leading groups through the mountains she'd always loved. These women understood something I was just beginning to learn, that life doesn't end when your primary role as wife and mother concludes. It transforms into something different, something that can be just as meaningful and much more authentic. During my third week in Montreux, I received an unexpected call from a lawyer in Portland. Richard had apparently decided to take legal action to recover his money, and the lawyer was calling to inform me that papers had been filed claiming I'd stolen marital assets. I referred him to my own lawyer, the one who'd helped me plan my departure, and felt a surge of satisfaction. Richard was about to learn exactly how thorough I'd been in my preparations. Every withdrawal I'd made was legal. Every asset I'd claimed was rightfully mine under Oregon's community property laws. And every document I'd signed had been properly notarized and filed. More importantly, Richard was about to learn something else, that filing legal action meant opening our entire financial history to scrutiny. The business he was so proud of, the one he'd built while I maintained his household, would be subject to forensic accounting. The investments he'd made with his money would be examined to determine exactly how much of their growth had occurred during our marriage. I suspected Richard's lawyer would quickly advise him to settle, rather than risk a full legal investigation into our marital assets. While Richard was discovering the legal realities of community property, I was discovering something else entirely, that I was genuinely happy for the first time in decades. I woke up excited about my day. I went to sleep satisfied with what I'd accomplished. I felt useful, valued, and purposeful in ways I'd forgotten were possible. My German was improving rapidly, partly because I was motivated and partly because Swiss German speakers were incredibly patient with learners. My hiking group had accepted me as a regular member, and I was keeping up with people 20 years younger than me on mountain trails that would have seemed impossible when I was sitting in my living room in Portland. Most importantly, I was making decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what someone else expected of me. I bought clothes I liked instead of clothes Richard would approve of. I ate at restaurants that interested me, instead of places that impressed business clients. I spent my money on experiences that brought me joy, instead of maintaining appearances for people whose opinions I didn't value. 1 month after my arrival in Switzerland, I received a call from Jennifer that made everything worth it. "Mom, I need to tell you something. Dad came to visit last weekend, and I've never seen him like this. He looks terrible. He's lost weight, he's not sleeping, and he can't stop talking about you." "What's he saying?" "He keeps asking if we've heard from you. He wants to know if you're okay, if you need anything, if you're planning to come back. But Mom, he also keeps saying things that make me think he's finally understanding what he lost." "What kind of things?" "Yesterday he was looking at pictures of our wedding, and he started crying. He said he'd forgotten how beautiful you looked that day, how proud he was to be marrying you. Then he started talking about all the things you did for our family that he'd stopped noticing. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but it was different now. Sadness for what we'd lost, but not regret for what I'd done." "He asked me if I thought you'd ever forgive him," Jennifer continued. "He said he'd been thinking about what he said to you on your anniversary, and he realized how cruel it was. He said he didn't know why he'd said those things, that he must have been trying to hurt you, but he didn't understand why." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that forgiveness was between you and him, but that if he wanted any chance of earning it, he needed to understand that what he said wasn't just cruel in the moment. It was the culmination of years of taking you for granted and treating you like you didn't matter." I felt proud of my daughter for seeing the situation so clearly. How did he respond to that? He cried harder. "Mom, I think he's finally realizing that he didn't just lose his wife. He lost his best friend, his partner, his support system, the person who made his entire life possible. And he's realizing that he threw it all away because he was too arrogant to appreciate what he had. That's a hard lesson to learn at 75. He also asked me something else. He wanted to know if I thought you were happier without him." The question hung in the air between us. I looked out at my balcony where I'd been reading in the sunshine before Jennifer called. At the view of the lake that never failed to fill me with peace. At the life I'd built in. Just 1 month of independence. "What did you tell him?" I told him the truth. That in the one conversation I've had with you since you left, you sounded more like yourself than I'd heard in years. More confident, more excited about life, more like the mom I remember from when we were kids. Your father and I were happy once, Jennifer, but that happiness got buried under years of routine and assumption and taking each other for granted. He stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a service provider, and I stopped believing I deserved to be seen as anything else. "Do you think you'll ever come back?" I considered the question seriously. "I don't know, honey. Right now I'm learning who Victoria Cambridge is when she's not defined by being Richard's wife. And I like what I'm discovering." "Would you consider talking to him? He's asked me to give you his new phone number. He changed his cell number because he was getting calls from lawyers and reporters about the missing person report." "Reporters?" "Apparently, when a successful businessman's wife disappears with millions of dollars, it makes the local news. Dad had to hire a public relations firm to manage the story. That information pleased me more than it probably should have. Richard cared deeply about his professional reputation, and having his personal life become tabloid fodder would be deeply uncomfortable for him. I'll think about talking to him, but not yet. I need more time to figure out what I want from the rest of my life. I understand. Mom, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Are you lonely? I know you've always been social, and you're in a foreign country where you don't really know anyone. I thought about my hiking group, my painting class, my book club, my German lessons. I thought about the conversations I'd had with other women who'd started over later in life. I thought about the refugee families I was helping and how grateful they were for my assistance with their children's English homework. I'm not lonely at all, sweetheart. I'm alone, but I'm not lonely. There's a difference. What's the difference? Lonely is when you're surrounded by people who don't see you or value you. Alone is when you're by yourself, but you like your own company. I spent the last 10 years of my marriage feeling desperately lonely. Now I'm alone, and I feel more connected to the world than I have in decades. After I hung up with Jennifer, I sat on my balcony thinking about Richard crying over our wedding pictures. The man who'd called me useless was apparently discovering what useful actually meant now that he was trying to manage his life without me. But as much as I'd loved him for 50 years, and as much as I felt sorry for his pain, I wasn't ready to rescue him from the consequences of his choices. Richard needed to learn that words had power, that taking someone for granted came with a price, and that calling your wife useless might result in that wife removing her usefulness from your life entirely. I opened my laptop and began writing an email to the 3 charities I'd included in my new will, organizations that helped older women develop new skills and find purpose after traditional homemaking roles ended. I wanted to make donations now, while I was alive, to see the impact, rather than waiting until after my death. If Richard thought I'd never contributed anything valuable to the world, I was about to prove him wrong in the most public way possible. My donations would fund programs that helped women exactly like me discover their worth, develop their capabilities, and build independent lives. The first charity would receive $500,000 to establish the Victoria Cambridge Center for Women's Empowerment, offering classes in financial literacy, career development, and personal growth for women over 50. The second would get $300,000 to fund scholarships for older women pursuing education or entrepreneurship. The third would receive $200,000 to provide housing assistance for women leaving long-term marriages who needed time to establish financial independence. As I typed the donation letters, I realized something that made me smile. By the time these gifts were announced, Richard would understand exactly what his useless wife was capable of accomplishing. And he'd have to see her name on buildings and programs that helped other women avoid the trap of financial dependence that had kept me tied to him for so long. Richard had called me useless, and I'd responded by using my freedom to help other women discover their own usefulness. It seemed like perfect justice. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Mom, Dad asked me to give you a message. He says he knows he was wrong and he wants to apologize. He also says he loves you, and he's sorry it took losing you to realize how much you mean to him." I stared at the message for a long time. 50 years of marriage. And it had taken my disappearance for Richard to remember that he loved me. That should have felt like a victory, but instead it felt like the saddest thing in the world. I typed back, "Tell your father that I appreciate the message. And tell him that someday, when I'm ready, we'll have a conversation about what love actually means, and whether it's possible to rebuild something that was broken so badly." Then I put my phone away and walked out onto my balcony to watch the sunset over Lake Geneva. Tomorrow I had hiking planned with my new friends, followed by dinner at a small restaurant where the owner had promised to teach me how to make authentic Swiss fondue. The day after that, I had a volunteer shift helping refugee children with their English homework. My calendar was full of activities I'd chosen, people I enjoyed, experiences that brought me joy. For the first time in 50 years, my time belonged entirely to me. Richard had given me the gift of clarity when he called me useless. He'd forced me to examine my life and decide what I actually wanted from whatever years I had left. And what I'd discovered was that I wanted to matter, to contribute, to be valued for who I was rather than what I provided for someone else. Whether that would ever again include being Richard's wife remained to be seen. But it would definitely include being Victoria Cambridge, independent woman, Swiss resident, and living proof that it's never too late to start over. 3 months into my Swiss adventure, I was preparing dinner in my kitchen when someone knocked on my apartment door. Living in Montreux had taught me that unexpected visitors were usually neighbors offering homemade pastries or fellow hikers suggesting spontaneous weekend trips. What I didn't expect when I opened the door was to find my husband standing in the hallway, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the 4 months since I'd seen him. Richard stood there holding a single suitcase, wearing a wrinkled shirt and pants that hung loose on his diminished frame. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Hello, Victoria," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Richard." I gripped the doorframe, my heart racing with a mixture of shock, anger, and something I couldn't quite identify. "How did you find me?" "Jennifer gave me your address. She said you might be ready to talk." He shifted his weight nervously. "May I come in?" I studied his face, looking for traces of the arrogant man who'd called me useless on our anniversary. What I saw instead was someone who looked broken, uncertain, almost fragile. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let him enter. Richard walked into my living room and stopped, taking in the view of Lake Geneva through the balcony doors, the fresh flowers on the dining table, the paintings I'd been working on displayed on easels near the windows. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "The whole place is beautiful." "What are you doing here, Richard?" He turned to face me, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. "I came to apologize. To beg you to come home. To tell you that I've been a fool and I know it." "It took you 4 months to figure that out?" "It took me 4 months to understand how completely I destroyed everything that mattered to me." He sat heavily on my sofa without being invited, burying his head in his hands. "Victoria, I don't know how to live without you." The admission should have felt like vindication, but instead it filled me with a strange sadness. "You managed just fine for 4 months." "No, I didn't manage. I fell apart completely." He looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Do you want to know what my life has been like since you left?" I crossed my arms and remained standing. "Tell me." "The first week, I thought you'd come back. I thought you were just making a point, trying to scare me into appreciating you more. I hired a cleaning service to replace you, ordered takeout every night, told myself I was better off without the constant demands on my time and attention." He paused, running his hands through his hair. "The second week, I realized you'd taken significant money from our accounts. I was furious. I called lawyers, threatened legal action, filed reports claiming you'd stolen from me. I was convinced you'd had some kind of breakdown and I'd have you declared incompetent." "And what did the lawyers tell you?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "They told me I was an idiot, that everything you'd taken was legally yours, that I had no grounds for any legal action, and that if I pushed the matter, you could probably claim even more of our assets under community property laws." That must have been educational. It was humiliating. But I was still angry, still convinced that you were being unreasonable and vindictive. I told everyone who'd listen that you'd lost your mind, that 50 years of marriage meant nothing to you, that you'd thrown away our life together over a simple misunderstanding. I felt my anger flaring. A simple misunderstanding? You called me useless, Richard. You told me I'd contributed nothing to our marriage. I know what I said. His voice broke. I know exactly what I said, and I know it was unforgivable. But Victoria, I didn't mean it. I was tired, stressed about business, frustrated with getting older, and I took it out on you in the cruelest way possible. You meant every word at the time. Maybe I did. Maybe I'd convinced myself that my success was entirely my own doing, that your contributions didn't matter because they weren't visible in the same way. Maybe I'd become so focused on financial achievement that I'd forgotten about every other kind of value. Richard stood and walked to my balcony doors, staring out at the lake. The third week, the cleaning service quit. They said our house was too big for weekly service and they couldn't maintain it properly with their standard schedule. I tried to hire a different company, but they wanted to charge 3 times what I was paying you in household allowance. Despite my anger, I felt a flicker of amusement. Expensive to replace a useless wife, isn't it? Victoria, please, let me finish. He turned back to me. I started trying to manage the house myself. Do you know how many things you did that I never even noticed? The grocery shopping, the meal planning, the laundry, the bill paying, the appointment scheduling, the maintenance coordination, the social calendar management. All those useless tasks that anyone could do, tasks that I couldn't do, at least not well, and not without it consuming enormous amounts of time and energy. Within a month, I was spending more hours managing household logistics than I'd ever spent working, and I was terrible at it. He walked back to the sofa but remained standing. I ran out of clean clothes because I couldn't figure out the washing machine settings. I missed 3 important appointments because I forgot to write them down. I ate nothing but restaurant food for 2 weeks because I couldn't figure out how to plan and shop for meals. Did you hire household staff? I tried. Do you know what good household managers cost? The ones who can actually replace what you did want salaries that are more than most people's annual income, and they still can't provide what you provided. Which was what, exactly? Richard's voice grew softer. Care, attention, knowledge of my preferences, my schedule, my needs. A good housekeeper can clean and cook. A good assistant can manage appointments and paperwork, but neither of them can anticipate what I need before I ask for it. Or remember that I prefer my coffee slightly cooled before I drink it. Or know that I get anxious before big presentations and need someone to talk through my concerns. I felt something shifting inside me, but I wasn't ready to soften yet. Those things you dismissed as worthless. Those things I took for granted until they were gone. He stepped closer to me. Victoria. By the 6th week, I was sleeping 4 hours a night and eating 1 meal a day. I'd lost 15 pounds and my doctor was concerned about my blood pressure. My business partner suggested I take a leave of absence because I was making mistakes I'd never made before. What kind of mistakes? I missed a client deadline because I forgot to follow up on a project. I showed up to a meeting with the wrong documents because I'd confused my schedule. I snapped at employees over minor issues because I was exhausted and overwhelmed. Richard sat down again, looking defeated. My entire life was falling apart, and I finally understood that it was falling apart because the person who'd been holding it together for 50 years was gone. The useless person. The most important person. His voice was barely audible. Victoria, I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I said and how I treated you. But I need you to know that I understand now. I understand that I didn't build our life alone. I understand that your contributions were essential, not supplementary. I understand that calling you useless was the stupidest, most hurtful, most inaccurate thing I've ever said. I walked to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, needing time to process what he was telling me. Through the window I could see the evening ferry crossing the lake, its lights reflecting on the darkening water. This had become my sanctuary. This quiet moment of daily beauty that belonged entirely to me. Richard, even if I believed that you finally understand my value, what exactly are you proposing? That I abandon the life I've built here and come back to being your household manager? I'm proposing that we start over. Differently this time. What does that mean? He joined me in the kitchen, keeping a respectful distance. It means I want to be your partner, not your employer. It means I want to share responsibilities instead of assuming you'll handle everything domestic while I focus on everything financial. It means I want to value your contributions, acknowledge your worth, and make sure you know every day how important you are to me. Pretty words, Richard. But you had 50 years to figure that out. Why should I believe you've changed in 4 months? Because losing you broke me completely. The raw honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Victoria, I don't just miss having clean clothes and home-cooked meals. I miss talking to you. I miss your laugh. I miss the way you used to tease me about taking myself too seriously. I miss having someone who knew me well enough to tell me when I was being an ass. I tried to tell you that for years. You stopped listening. You're right. I did stop listening. I got so caught up in being successful that I forgot about being human. I forgot that the point of financial security was supposed to be creating a good life, not just accumulating wealth. Richard leaned against my kitchen counter, looking around at the simple, comfortable space I'd created. Can I tell you what made me finally understand what I'd lost? I nodded, curious despite myself. 2 months after you left, I got sick. Just a bad flu. Nothing serious, but I was bedridden for 4 days. I lay in our empty house, weak and miserable, and realized that for the first time in 50 years, no one was taking care of me. No one was bringing me soup or checking my temperature or making sure I was drinking enough fluids. He paused, gathering himself. I called in sick to work, but I had to explain to my assistant how to reschedule my appointments because I'd never had to think about those details before. I tried to order groceries online, but I didn't know what to order because I'd never planned meals for recovery from illness. What did you do? I ordered pizza and spent 4 days feeling sorry for myself. But more than that, I spent 4 days understanding what it meant to be truly alone. Not independent, not self-sufficient, just alone. And I realized that I'd been alone for years without knowing it. Because you'd been handling all the details that made life manageable. Richard's eyes filled with tears again. When I was lying there sick and miserable, I kept thinking about all the times you'd been sick over the years, and I'd barely noticed because you still managed to keep everything running. I kept thinking about how you'd taken care of me through my surgery 10 years ago, and my recovery from the car accident, and that bout of pneumonia, and I'd never once thanked you properly. I didn't do those things for thanks, Richard. I did them because I loved you. I know you did, and I took that love for granted until it was gone. We stood in my kitchen in silence for several minutes. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that still took my breath away after 4 months of Swiss sunsets. Victoria, can I ask you something? What? Are you happy here? The question was harder to answer than it should have been. I'm content here. I'm discovering who I am when I'm not defined by being your wife. I'm learning new skills, meeting interesting people, contributing to my community in ways that matter to me. That's not the same as being happy, isn't it? Richard studied my face carefully. You look beautiful, you know, younger somehow, more relaxed than I've seen you in years. Freedom suits me. It does. But, Victoria, I need to ask you something difficult, and I need you to be honest with me. What? Do you still love me? The question hung between us like a challenge. I looked at this man I'd shared 50 years with, who'd been my partner in raising children and building a life, who'd also been the source of years of diminishing self-worth and emotional neglect. I love the man I married, I said finally. I love the memories of who we used to be together. But Richard, I don't know if I love who you became, and I don't know if you can become someone I could love again. What would it take for me to become someone you could love again? The question surprised me with its directness. I don't know. Maybe I need to understand why you changed, why the man who used to value my opinions stopped listening to me, why the man who used to appreciate my contributions started taking them for granted. Richard was quiet for a long time, staring out at the lake. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, searching. I think it happened gradually, so gradually that I didn't notice it was happening. When we were young, I needed you in obvious ways. I needed your emotional support when I was starting my career. I needed your help managing our finances when money was tight. I needed your input on major decisions because I wasn't confident enough to make them alone. And when I became successful, I stopped needing you in those obvious ways. I had employees to provide professional support. I had enough money to hire help with things I didn't want to do myself. I had enough confidence to make decisions without consultation. So you decided I was no longer necessary. I never consciously decided that. But I think subconsciously I started seeing your contributions as less important because they weren't about things I struggled with anymore. You were still managing our household, still providing emotional support, still maintaining our social connections, but those things seemed easy to me because I wasn't doing them. Richard turned to face me directly. I think I fell into the trap of believing that the things I was good at were more valuable than the things you were good at. Financial success became my measure of worth. And since you weren't contributing to that directly, I started diminishing the value of everything you were contributing. That's a very clinical analysis. I've had 4 months to think about it. 4 months to realize that financial success means nothing if you don't have anyone to share it with. 4 months to understand that a big house is just an empty building if there's no one there who cares about you. I poured myself another glass of water, buying time to think. Richard, even if you understand intellectually what went wrong, how do I know you won't fall back into the same patterns? How do I know that if we got back together, you wouldn't gradually start taking me for granted again? You don't know that. I don't know that either. All I can tell you is that I'm terrified of making the same mistakes again, and that terror might be enough to keep me conscious of my behavior in ways I wasn't before. Terror isn't the foundation for a healthy relationship. No, but gratitude might be. Victoria, I'm grateful for every single thing you did for our family over 50 years. I'm grateful for the sacrifices you made, the support you provided, the love you gave even when I stopped appreciating it properly. If you gave me another chance, I'd spend every day making sure you knew how grateful I am. And what would that look like practically? If I came back, what would be different? Richard had clearly thought about this question. We'd share household responsibilities. I'd learn to cook, to clean, to manage the logistics of daily life instead of assuming you'd handle everything. We'd make major decisions together instead of me assuming my opinion was more important. We'd pursue your interests as seriously as we've always pursued mine. What interests? You told me I didn't have any interests worth pursuing. I was wrong about that too. You've always been interested in art, in literature, in helping people. You wanted to travel, to learn languages, to volunteer with charitable organizations. I dismissed those interests because they didn't contribute to financial goals, but they're the things that make life meaningful. I looked around my Swiss apartment, thinking about the painting classes and hiking groups and volunteer work that had filled my days with purpose. I've been pursuing those interests here. I've been discovering what I'm capable of when no one is telling me my passions are frivolous. I know. Jennifer told me about your donations to women's charities. She said you're funding programs that help older women develop independence and new skills. Those donations bothered you? They humbled me. They showed me that you weren't just taking money and running away to be selfish. You were using your freedom to help other women avoid the trap I'd created for you. Richard walked to my balcony doors and looked out at the darkening lake. Victoria, I know I don't deserve a second chance. I know I hurt you in ways that might be unforgivable. But I also know that we had 50 years of love before I became so stupid and arrogant that I forgot how to appreciate you. 50 years that ended with you calling me useless. One terrible moment that I'd spend the rest of my life trying to make up for, if you'd let me. I joined him at the balcony doors, looking out at the lights beginning to twinkle across the lake. Richard, what if I said I needed more time? What if I wasn't ready to make any decisions about our future? Then I'd wait. I'd go back to Portland and try to become the kind of man who deserves another chance with you. I'd get counseling to understand why I became so dismissive of your worth. I'd learn to manage my own life instead of expecting someone else to do it for me. And if I ultimately decided I wanted to stay here permanently? The question clearly hurt him, but he answered honestly. Then I'd accept that decision and try to figure out how to live with the consequences of my choices. You wouldn't try to convince me to come back? You wouldn't pressure our children to intervene on your behalf? Victoria, I spent 50 years taking your presence in my life for granted. I won't make the mistake of assuming I'm entitled to it now. We stood in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the lake. I thought about the life I'd built in Switzerland, the independence I'd discovered, the confidence I'd developed. I thought about the man standing beside me, who seemed genuinely changed by the experience of losing everything he'd taken for granted. Richard, I need to tell you something. What? I'm not the same woman who left Portland 4 months ago. I've changed. I've discovered parts of myself that were buried under 50 years of putting everyone else's needs before my own. If we were to have any kind of future together, it would have to be with the person I am now, not the person you remember. What's different about you now? I thought about how to explain the transformation I'd undergone. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid of making decisions, of expressing opinions, of taking up space in the world. I'm not afraid of being alone, which means I wouldn't be staying with you out of fear or dependency. What would you be staying for? Love. But not the kind of love where I disappear into your life. The kind of love where we're both complete individuals who choose to share a life together. Richard nodded slowly. I think I'd like to meet that version of you. I think I'd like to learn how to love someone as a partner, instead of trying to love someone as an extension of myself. And I think I'd like to see if you're capable of that kind of love. Does that mean you're willing to try? I looked out at Lake Geneva one more time, memorizing the view that had become so dear to me. It means I'm willing to consider it. But Richard, if we're going to try to rebuild something, it's going to be different from what we had before. It's going to require both of us to change, not just you. How would you need to change? I'd need to learn how to be direct about my needs instead of hoping you'd notice them. I'd need to stop accommodating behavior that diminishes me, just to keep the peace. I'd need to maintain my independence even within a partnership. That sounds healthier than what we had before. It would be. But it might also be harder. It's easier to fall into old patterns than to create new ones. Richard turned to face me fully. Victoria, would you consider coming back to Portland for a trial period? Not permanently, not with any promises, just to see if we can learn how to be married to each other differently? What about my life here? Keep your apartment. Keep your Swiss residency. Think of it as an extended visit rather than a permanent move. If it doesn't work out, you come back here with no questions asked. The proposal was more reasonable than I'd expected. How long of a trial period? 6 months? Long enough to see if we can develop new patterns, but not so long that you'd be trapped if you decided it wasn't working. I considered the offer. 6 months in Portland, trying to rebuild a relationship with the man who'd called me useless. 6 months of discovering whether Richard could actually change. Whether I could trust him again. Whether we could create something new from the ruins of what we'd had before. I'd want my own space. Not the guest room, but my own apartment or small house where I could retreat when I needed independence. Done. I'll help you find something perfect. I'd want to continue my charitable work, my art classes, my volunteer activities. No more dismissing my interests as frivolous. I'd want to learn about them. Maybe even participate if you'd let me. And Richard, if at any point during those 6 months I decided it wasn't working, you'd accept that decision without argument? I'd accept it. And I'd help you get back to Switzerland with no drama, no guilt trips, no attempts to change your mind. I walked out onto my balcony, breathing the crisp mountain air and thinking about the choice before me. Stay in the beautiful, peaceful life I'd created for myself, or risk that peace to see if love could be rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than dependence and obligation. Victoria? Richard's voice was tentative. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that 4 months ago, you called me useless and destroyed our marriage. Tonight, you're asking me to rebuild it with you as an equal partner. Yes, I'm thinking that's either the most hopeful thing I've ever heard or the most foolish. Which do you think it is? I turned to look at him, this man I'd loved for 50 years, and left 4 months ago. He looked older, sadder, but also somehow more real than he had in years. The arrogance was gone, replaced by humility. The assumption of entitlement was gone, replaced by gratitude. I think it might be both, I said finally. Hopeful and foolish at the same time. Are you willing to find out which one it is? I looked back at Lake Geneva, at the peaceful life I'd built, at the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve. Then I looked at Richard, waiting for an answer that would determine both our futures. Yes, I said quietly. I'm willing to find out. The relief on his face was overwhelming. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if we make it through 6 months and discover we can actually love each other as equals. When would you want to start this trial period? After the holidays. I want to spend Christmas here, in my own space, making my own decisions. In January, I'll come to Portland and we'll see if it's possible to rebuild something from what we destroyed. Richard nodded. I'll spend the holidays figuring out how to be worthy of this chance. That night, after Richard had gone to his hotel, I sat on my balcony under a sky full of stars and thought about the conversation we'd had. Part of me wondered if I was making a mistake, risking the peace and independence I'd found for the uncertainty of trying to rebuild a relationship that had caused me so much pain. But another part of me was curious about the man Richard might become, if he truly understood the value of partnership over dominance. Curious about what love might look like when it was built on mutual respect, rather than traditional gender roles, curious about whether it was possible to create something new and better from the ashes of something that had been broken so badly. I thought about the Victoria who had left Portland 4 months ago, broken and demoralized by being called useless. And I thought about the Victoria I'd become in Switzerland, confident and independent and clear about her own worth. The first Victoria might have been too damaged to try again. The second Victoria was strong enough to take the risk, secure enough in her own value to walk away if necessary. Whether Richard and I could build something beautiful together remained to be seen, but I was no longer afraid of finding out. 3 weeks later, I flew back to Switzerland after spending Christmas in Portland with Richard. The trial period had gone better than I'd dared to hope. Richard had rented me a small cottage 10 minutes from our family home, and he'd kept every promise he'd made about sharing responsibilities and respecting my independence. Most importantly, he'd kept his promise about accepting my decision if I chose to return to Switzerland permanently. Because that's exactly what I'd decided to do. Not because our trial period had failed, but because it had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. Richard and I had discovered that we could love each other as equals, that we could be partners, instead of him being the boss and me being the employee. We'd learned how to negotiate disagreements respectfully, how to support each other's individual interests, and how to share domestic responsibilities without resentment. We'd also discovered that we could build a life together in Switzerland just as easily as we could in Portland. Richard had fallen in love with Montreux during his visits, and his business was successful enough that he could manage it remotely with occasional trips back to Oregon. So we were selling the Portland house and making Switzerland our permanent home. Richard would join me in Montreux as soon as the business sale was finalized, and we'd start the next chapter of our lives as true partners in a place that represented new beginnings for both of us. The woman he'd called useless had not only survived his cruelty, but had thrived beyond it. And in the end, that strength had made it possible for us to find our way back to each other on completely different terms. Love, I'd learned, was not about dependency or obligation. It was about two whole people, choosing each other every day, supporting each other's growth, and building something together that was stronger than what either could create alone. Richard had called me useless, and I'd proven him spectacularly wrong. But more than that, I'd discovered my own worth in ways that had nothing to do with his opinion of me. That, I thought as I unpacked my suitcase in my Swiss apartment, was the most valuable lesson of all. 1 year after Richard joined me in Switzerland, we were hosting our first Thanksgiving dinner in our new home overlooking Lake Geneva. The house we'd purchased together was smaller than our Portland mansion but infinitely more comfortable, with large windows that framed the alpine views and cozy spaces designed for actual living rather than impressing visitors. I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner while Richard set the table in the dining room, a division of labor that would have been unthinkable during our first 50 years of marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who'd once called me useless was now carefully folding napkins and arranging centerpieces, having discovered that domestic tasks weren't beneath his dignity after all. Our 3 children had flown in from the States for the holiday, along with Jennifer's husband and their 2 children. It was the first time our entire family had been together since my dramatic departure from Portland 18 months earlier, and everyone seemed curious to see how the new version of their parents' marriage was working out. Sarah emerged from the guest room where she'd been settling her luggage and joined me in the kitchen. At 48, she looked remarkably like I had at her age, though with more confidence and self-assurance than I'd possessed then. Her medical practice in Seattle was thriving, and she'd recently been promoted to chief of cardiology at her hospital. "Mom, this place is incredible," she said, gazing out the kitchen window at the lake. "I can see why you fell in love with it here. It grows on you," I agreed, checking the turkey in the oven. "The piece is addictive. And Dad seems different. More relaxed. More present." I glanced into the dining room where Richard was explaining Swiss wine regions to Michael while Jennifer's children climbed on his lap. The scene would have been impossible in our old life, where Richard's business calls and stress levels made family gatherings feel like obligations rather than celebrations. He is different. We both are. "Are you happy, Mom? Really happy?" It was a question Sarah had asked me several times since my return to Switzerland, as if she couldn't quite believe that her parents' marriage had survived such a dramatic rupture and emerged stronger than before. "I'm happier than I've been in years," I said honestly. But more than that, I'm myself in ways I'd forgotten were possible. What do you mean? I set down my basting brush and turned to face my daughter. For 50 years, I defined myself primarily as your father's wife and your mother. Those were important roles, and I don't regret them, but somewhere along the way I lost track of who Victoria was as an individual. And now? Now I know who I am apart from my relationships. I have my own interests, my own friends, my own sense of purpose. That makes me a better partner to your father, and a more interesting person in general. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Jennifer mentioned that you're running some kind of women's program here. I started a support group for expatriate women over 50. We meet twice a week at the community center. Some are widows who moved here after their husbands died, others are divorced women starting over, and a few are like me, married women who needed to rediscover their independence. That sounds meaningful. It is. These women have incredible stories and enormous wisdom, but many of them struggle with feeling invisible or worthless after major life changes. We help each other remember that our value doesn't depend on our roles in other people's lives. Michael wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the conversation and probably the smell of cooking food. At 46, he'd inherited his father's analytical mind, but had managed to avoid Richard's tendency toward emotional detachment. His tech job in San Francisco allowed him to work remotely several months a year, and he'd been taking advantage of that flexibility to spend extended time in Switzerland. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said last night about learning German," he said, stealing a piece of bread from the basket I was preparing. "Are there business language courses available here? I'm considering opening a European office for my company, and German would be essential. There are excellent programs in Geneva and Zurich. Why don't you talk to your father about it? He's been taking intensive courses and could probably recommend instructors." Michael looked surprised. "Dad's learning German? Since when does he bother with foreign languages?" Since he realized that living in Switzerland as an English-only speaker was limiting his ability to integrate into the community. He's actually quite good at it now. That's unexpected. I understood Michael's surprise. The Richard he'd grown up with had always dismissed foreign languages as unnecessary complications, insisting that English was sufficient for international business. But the Richard who'd moved to Switzerland had embraced the challenge of learning German with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a hidden talent. "Your father has surprised me in many ways over the past year," I said. "He's become much more curious about the world, and less convinced that his way of doing things is automatically the best way." Jennifer appeared in the kitchen doorway with her 6-year-old daughter Emma clinging to her hand. At 43, Jennifer had always been the most perceptive of our children, probably because she'd been watching family dynamics from the youngest child's perspective. "Mom, Emma wants to know if she can help cook something," Jennifer said. "She's been fascinated by your kitchen setup." I looked down at my granddaughter, who was staring up at me with wide, hopeful eyes. "Would you like to help me make the stuffing, Emma?" "Yes, please. Mommy says you're the best cook in the family." I lifted Emma onto a sturdy stool beside the counter and handed her a wooden spoon. "Well, I've had lots of practice, but cooking is more fun when you have helpers." As Emma carefully stirred the stuffing ingredients under my supervision, I caught Jennifer watching us with a thoughtful expression. Later, when Emma had been distracted by cartoons in the living room, Jennifer pulled me aside. "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret the way you left? I mean, the drama of disappearing with all that money and forcing Dad to figure out what he'd lost?" I considered the question carefully. "I regret that it took such extreme measures to wake him up. I regret that we lost so many years to patterns that weren't healthy for either of us. But do I regret leaving dramatically? No. Subtle hints and quiet conversations hadn't worked for years. Sometimes people need to lose something completely before they understand its value. Dad told me he spent the first month after you left convinced that you were having some kind of breakdown. I know. He couldn't imagine that a rational person would leave a comfortable life and start over at 72. The possibility that I was making a thoughtful choice based on legitimate grievances was too threatening to his worldview. What changed his mind? Reality. He tried to replace me with hired help, and discovered that what I'd been providing wasn't just household services. It was partnership, emotional support, institutional memory, and genuine care. You can't buy those things. Jennifer nodded slowly. He also told me that he'd started seeing you as, what was the word he used? Overhead rather than an asset. That's a good way to put it. I'd become a cost center in his mental accounting rather than a source of value. The irony is that my departure forced him to account for all the ways I'd been contributing, and the real cost of replacing me was far higher than he'd imagined. And now? Now he sees me as a partner rather than an employee. We make decisions together, we support each other's individual interests, and we both contribute to maintaining our life together. It sounds almost businesslike when you put it that way. I laughed. In some ways, a good marriage is like a good business partnership. Both parties need to contribute value, both need to feel appreciated, and both need to benefit from the arrangement. The difference is that marriage also includes love, intimacy, and emotional connection. Do you still love Dad? I mean, after everything that happened? I love the man he's become over the past year. Whether that's the same person I married 51 years ago, or someone entirely new, I'm not sure. But yes, I love him. And he loves you? He loves me in ways he never learned how to love me before. He sees me clearly now, appreciates my contributions, and treats me as an equal rather than a dependent. That kind of love is much more sustainable than the kind we had in our younger years. The conversation was interrupted by Richard calling from the dining room that dinner was ready. As our family gathered around the table, I looked at the faces of the people who mattered most to me and felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. During dinner, the conversation naturally turned to our lives in Switzerland and how different they were from our old routines in Portland. Richard, who had always dominated dinner conversations with business talk, was asking thoughtful questions about everyone's work and interests. Sarah, how are you finding the balance between your administrative duties and actual patient care? He asked, cutting his turkey with the precision he'd once reserved for contract negotiations. It's challenging, Sarah admitted. The more successful I become administratively, the less time I spend doing the medical work that drew me to cardiology in the first place. That's a common problem in professional advancement, Richard said. You get promoted based on your technical skills, then find yourself managing people and processes instead of practicing your craft. Exactly. How do you handle that balance? I learned the hard way that success without fulfillment is just expensive misery. When I sold my practice and moved here, I thought I'd miss the deal-making and client management. Instead, I discovered that what I actually missed was the problem-solving and financial analysis that had drawn me to accounting originally. Michael looked up from his plate with interest. So what do you do with your time now? I've been doing financial consulting for small businesses here in Switzerland. Nothing as high pressure as what I used to do, but it allows me to use my skills in ways that feel meaningful rather than just profitable. That's a big change from running a major firm. It is, but I'm learning that bigger isn't always better, and more isn't always more satisfying. I watched this conversation with amazement. The Richard I'd been married to for 50 years would never have admitted to prioritizing fulfillment over financial success, would never have acknowledged that his previous definition of achievement might have been flawed. Jennifer's husband Mark, who had been quiet during most of the meal, finally spoke up. Richard, can I ask you something that might be too personal? Sure. How do you go about rebuilding trust after a relationship has been damaged as badly as yours was? Jennifer and I have been married 15 years, and we've had our rough patches, but nothing like what you two went through. Richard set down his fork and considered the question seriously. The first step was accepting that I'd been wrong about fundamental things. Not just wrong about Victoria's value, but wrong about what marriage was supposed to be, wrong about how partnership works, wrong about what love actually requires. That must have been hard to acknowledge. It was devastating. I'd built my entire identity around being successful and competent, and I had to face the fact that I had been failing at the most important relationship in my life for years, without even realizing it. Victoria picked up the thread. For me, the key was learning to articulate my needs clearly instead of hoping Richard would notice them. I'd spent decades accommodating his behavior and resenting him for it, instead of directly addressing problems when they occurred. How do you prevent falling back into old patterns? Mark asked. We have weekly check-ins, Richard said. Every Sunday morning, we sit down with coffee and talk about how the previous week went, what worked well, what could be improved, and what we need from each other in the coming week. That sounds very structured. It is. I agreed. But structure prevents small irritations from building into major resentments. It's much easier to address issues when they're minor than to wait until they explode into arguments. Plus, Richard added, it forces us to stay conscious of our relationship dynamics instead of taking each other for granted. Emma, who had been quietly coloring at the table while the adults talked, suddenly looked up. Grandpa, why do you and Grandma talk funny now? What do you mean, sweetheart? You say please and thank you to each other all the time. My mommy and daddy don't do that. The adults all laughed, but Emma's observation was astute. Richard and I had indeed become much more formally polite with each other, treating each other with the courtesy we'd show respected colleagues rather than taking each other's efforts for granted. That's because we learned that being married doesn't mean you stop needing to be kind to each other, I explained to Emma. Sometimes people forget to use their good manners with the people they love most. That's silly, Emma declared. You should be extra nice to people you love. You're absolutely right, Richard said, smiling at his granddaughter. It took us a long time to figure that out. After dinner, while Richard and the kids cleaned up the kitchen, another role reversal that would have been unthinkable in our old life, I took my coffee out to the terrace to watch the sunset over the lake. The November air was crisp, but not uncomfortably cold, and the mountains across the water were dusted with early snow. Sarah joined me on the terrace, wrapping herself in one of the blankets I kept outside for exactly this purpose. Mom, I have to admit something. When you first left Dad, I was angry with you. I know you were. You thought I was being dramatic and destructive. I thought you were throwing away 50 years of marriage over hurt feelings. I didn't understand how bad things had gotten between you two. I didn't want you children to see how bad it was. I thought I was protecting the family by keeping my unhappiness private. But that meant we couldn't support you when you needed it. True. But it also meant you could maintain good relationships with your father without feeling like you had to choose sides. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the light fade over the water. Do you think you would have left eventually anyway, even if Dad hadn't said what he said on your anniversary? I don't know. I might have continued indefinitely in a marriage that was slowly killing my spirit. Sometimes it takes a moment of crystal clarity to realize that what you're accepting isn't acceptable. What he said was incredibly cruel. It was. But it was also honest in a way that forced me to confront the reality of our relationship. Better to know where I stood than to continue living in denial. Are you glad it happened? I considered the question carefully. I'm glad it led to where we are now. I'm glad I discovered my own strength and independence. I'm glad your father learned what partnership actually means. I'm glad we're building something new together based on mutual respect rather than tradition and habit. But you could have had this realization without the pain of that confrontation. Maybe? But major change often requires major disruption. Comfortable situations don't motivate people to grow. Richard appeared on the terrace carrying his own coffee, having finished his kitchen duties. Mind if I join you? Of course not, Sarah said, making room for him on the outdoor sofa. Richard settled beside me and put his arm around my shoulders, a gesture that felt natural and welcome rather than possessive or automatic. Beautiful evening, he said, gazing out at the lake. It is. I never get tired of this view. I was thinking, Richard said, that we should plan a trip back to Portland in the spring. I'd like to see how our old house looks with the new owners. Are you nostalgic for it? Not nostalgic exactly. Curious. I want to see if the place that represented so much unhappiness for both of us looks different when someone else is living their dreams there. Sarah looked between us with interest. Do you miss anything about your old life? I miss the convenience of having everything in English, I said. And I miss being close enough to see you kids more often. But I don't miss the person I was in that life, Richard added. I don't miss the stress, the constant focus on business growth, the assumption that more money would solve whatever problems we had. What do you like best about your life now? The pace, Richard said immediately. We have time to actually enjoy things instead of rushing from one obligation to the next. And the equality, I added. We're both contributing to our life together in ways that feel meaningful rather than obligatory. Plus, Richard said with a smile, your mother has become much more interesting since she stopped trying to be the perfect wife and started being herself. I was always interesting. You just weren't paying attention. True, I was too busy being important to notice how remarkable you are. Sarah watched this exchange with visible amusement. You two are like newlyweds who actually like each other. That's not far from the truth, I said. We're learning how to be married to each other for the first time. Later that evening, after our children had gone to bed in various guest rooms throughout the house, Richard and I sat by the fireplace with glasses of Swiss wine, enjoying the quiet aftermath of a successful family gathering. That went well, Richard said, stretching his legs toward the fire. It did. The kids seemed to understand that we're genuinely happier now. Jennifer told me she was worried we were just pretending to be okay for their benefit. What convinced her we weren't? She said she'd never seen us actually enjoy each other's company before. That our conversations used to be about logistics and schedules, not ideas and feelings. I thought about that observation. She's right. We used to coordinate our lives without really sharing them. I used to think that was efficient. Get the business of living handled quickly, so we could get back to our individual priorities. And now I understand that the business of living is actually the point. The daily conversations, the shared decisions, the small kindnesses. That's what marriage is made of, not just the big milestones. You've become quite philosophical. I've had time to think, and I've had a good teacher. I looked at him curiously. What do you mean? Watching you build a life here from scratch taught me things about resilience and adaptability that I'd never learned in 50 years of business success. You showed me what courage actually looks like. It didn't feel courageous at the time. It felt necessary. Same thing sometimes. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. I thought about the woman who had left Portland 18 months earlier, broken and demoralized by her husband's cruel words. That woman had believed her worth was tied to other people's opinions of her value. The woman sitting by this fireplace knew better. I'd learned that my worth was inherent, not earned through service or validated through appreciation. That knowledge had made it possible for me to choose love rather than settle for security, to demand respect rather than accept dismissal. Victoria, Richard said quietly, can I tell you something I've never said before? What? I'm proud of you. For leaving, for building an independent life, for being strong enough to give us another chance without giving up your independence. That means a lot to hear. I should have been saying it all along. I should have been proud of the woman I married instead of taking her for granted. We can't change the past, Richard. We can only do better going forward. Are you happy with how we're doing going forward? I considered the question seriously. Over the past year, Richard had kept every promise he'd made about sharing responsibilities and respecting my autonomy. He'd learned to cook, to clean, to manage his own schedule. He'd supported my volunteer work and encouraged my artistic pursuits. Most importantly, he'd learned to see me as a partner rather than a service provider. But beyond his changes, I'd discovered things about myself that I'd never known. I was braver than I'd thought, more adaptable than I'd imagined, and more capable of independence than I'd ever believed possible. Those discoveries had made me a better partner because I was choosing our marriage from strength rather than dependency. I'm very happy with how we're doing, I said finally. We're building something new that's better than what we had before. Even though it took such a dramatic crisis to get here, especially because it took a dramatic crisis. Sometimes destruction is necessary before reconstruction can begin. Richard reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers in front of the dying fire. I love you, Victoria. Not the way I thought I loved you before, but in a way that actually sees who you are and values what you bring to our life together. I love you too, the man you've become and the partnership we're creating. Do you think we'll make it, long term? I think we have a better chance now than we ever did before. We're choosing each other with full knowledge of who we really are, rather than staying together out of habit or fear. That's more than most couples can say after 51 years of marriage. It is. And we earned it the hard way. As we prepared for bed that night, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. Richard calling me useless had been the catalyst for the most transformative period of my life. What had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. The start of discovering who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's expectations. The woman who had fled to Switzerland 18 months ago had been running away from pain and rejection. The woman living in this beautiful house beside Lake Geneva was running toward possibility and growth. The difference was everything. Tomorrow, our children would fly back to their own lives, probably with a better understanding of what their parents' marriage had become. Richard and I would return to our peaceful routine of shared responsibilities, individual pursuits, and genuine partnership. I'd proven that I wasn't useless, but more importantly, I'd learned that my usefulness didn't define my worth. I was valuable simply because I existed, not because of what I provided for others. That knowledge had set me free to love and be loved in ways I'd never imagined possible. And it had taken being called useless to discover just how useful I could be when I was finally free to be myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.